Hi everyone, my name is Megan McTaggart and I'm a research coordinator on SPARK at Kennedy Krieger Institute Center for Autism and Related Disorders. And I wanted to welcome you guys to our first webinar with Pathfinders for Autism. And we're so grateful for them hosting the webinar today. And I would like to introduce Elisa Blesson. She is a genetic counselor at the Kennedy Krieger Institute Center for Autism and Related Disorders and Neurogenetics Clinics in Baltimore. She received her master's degree in genetic counseling from the University of Maryland School of Medicine and is certified by the American Board of Genetic Counseling. Today, she's going to provide an overview of our current understanding of the relationships between genetics and autism and discuss the aspects to consider when undergoing genetic testing. And just a friendly reminder before we begin today, to please turn off your cameras and place your microphones on mute. And without further ado, I will hand it over to Elisa.
Thank you, Megan, for the introduction. And hi, everyone. It is an absolute honor to be able to speak to you today about a topic that is near and dear to my heart, thinking about the genetics and autism and genetic testing. So hopefully I will not take up too much of your time today, but we have a lot of information to potentially go through, and definitely we will have time for questions at the end too. So I have no conflicts of interest. Now I have two disclaimers to make about this presentation. Number one is, as you'll see in this first objective, this is really going to be some general background information on our current understanding between the relationship of genetics and ASD. So there's so many different aspects to consider and so many nuances with this process. And I wish, we could talk about this for 8 hours or a full week and still not cover everything. So today is very much an overview or general understanding, as well as everything I'm talking about today is our current understanding. So everything is subject to change and definitely will as we continue to learn more about this topic too. I'm also going to be talking about different types of genetic tests and how we approach considering genetic testing in an individual who has an established diagnosis of ASD. And then my last and final objective, and really my biggest hope from this presentation, is all of you, anyone who's listening or watching this after, really feels empowered to make their own decisions about genetic testing and if it's the right thing for them and their family, and if they want to participate in these types of things too. So truly, this is meant to start a conversation and give you guys some background information as well. So quick overview, we're going to start from the very beginning with Genetics 101, and then we'll talk more about genetic testing. I'm going to talk a little bit about a little bit about genetic counseling and what I do on a day-to-day basis. And then I'll give you guys some takeaway points. And again, at the end, we'll have time for questions as well. Okay. I hate doing presentations that make it seem like I'm lecturing right at all of you. So I did try to throw in a couple pop culture references and memes in here, but we'll see how well they translate as well. But when it comes to starting from the very beginning with genetics, Sound of Music, we're going to start right at the beginning when it comes to thinking about how all of us are made up of trillions of cells. And within all of these cells are 20,000 genes. And I think of each gene like an instruction manual or a book that our body reads to tell us how we look, how we grow, how we function, how we develop, all of those things. And we know that our genes are made up of DNA. And all of our 20,000 plus genes that each of us have in our cells are all spread amongst or packaged into these structures called chromosomes. So this is a good overview, but I feel like analogies are very helpful when we're thinking about science and taking you all back to high school biology a little bit. So again, we think of a gene like an instruction manual or a book that our body reads to tell us how we look, grow, develop, and function. And we think of the chromosomes that contain all of those genes. So if I have a picture of one chromosome here, it's one bookshelf that has many, many genes on it. And when we think about our chromosomes as well, we all have 23 pairs, with the last pair being the sex chromosome. So girls have 2 X's and boys have an X and a Y. And for each chromosome pair that you see in front of you in this picture here, you get 1 from mom and 1 from dad. So this is how we're able to say, no matter who you look like on the outside or who you feel like you resemble more, I promise everyone you are 50% mom, 50% dad, at least when it comes to your genetic information here. So again, we have our chromosomes like that bookshelf that contains all of our 20,000 genes spread amongst the 23 pairs of chromosomes. And again, each gene is like that instruction manual. And instead of a book being read with our normal alphabet, our genes are written in sequences or patterns of DNA letters. So those A's, T's, G's, and C's that are in a specific order or sentence that our body reads. And that makes up that gene. And what our body ends up doing is when we have a gene, the body will group the DNA letters into groups of 3, just like in this picture here, to create a cellular protein. So different kind of protein than what you get in meat or food. These are cellular proteins, which I think of as carrying out the job or the function or the messenger, saying this is what this gene's instruction is. So again, if a gene's like an instruction manual, I think of the protein like the tool that's being created through that instruction manual that's going to carry out the job of that gene. So we all have the same 20,000 genes and we all have the same 23 pairs of chromosomes. There is no such thing as the autism gene or the autism chromosome or the development gene, the brain gene. We all have the same genes. Instead, what we talk about is we all have genetic changes within those genes, within those chromosomes. And we use the word variant, which we'll talk about in a little bit too, but most of the genetic changes that all of us are born with that are there from the minute egg and sperm comes together are completely normal. They're what makes us unique, why we have different hair colors, eye colors, things like that, and don't cause any major problems. But in our context, in my world of genetics, what we're thinking about are usually really rare, powerful genetic changes that might have a big effect on someone's development, learning, and behavior. So in this picture example here, you might have one version of the gene where at this specific spot, we expect there to be a letter T, but instead in another person who has the same exact gene, maybe they have a letter A. And the question is always going to be, what is the effect of that genetic change here? And again, same gene, you can think of it just as a different version because it's a different genetic change there. And so when we think about genetic changes, again, you'll hear me say throughout this presentation the word variant. And in the past, we may have said the word mutation, but we're really trying to get away from the word mutation just as a whole in the genetics community, because there can be a negative connotation, or I think a lot of families I talk to will bring up X-Men and things like that. So in our world, we're really trying to use variant because it's a neutral term and it just means there's a change in the DNA. It doesn't have to have a qualifier in front of it. And again, I'm going to sound like a broken record with some of these things throughout the presentation. Everyone has genetic changes. Most of them are what we call benign or normal and can be very common in the general population. But for the most part, when it comes to the genetic testing that we're going to be talking about today and the genetic changes we're looking at rare, powerful genetic changes that can have a big effect as well. The other kind of complicated factor that we're going to talk about in a little bit that I've hinted at is genetic change variant just means there's a change there. But there's so many different types of genetic changes. You can have a change or a variant that affects your chromosomes. And because there's many genes on the chromosomes, it might have a bigger effect affecting other genes. Or you could have just a change in one specific gene, kind of like the example I just showed, where it's just one specific location in that one gene. So many different possibilities. And this kind of gives us a nice segue into bringing the two together, genetics and ASD. So I have several themes or takeaway points sprinkled throughout the presentation. And the one that I say most often anytime I meet with someone or talk about genetics is, we know a lot, but we still don't know everything. We have such room to grow. And so when it comes to cause, when we think of neurodevelopmental disorders, in which autism is one example, and there are others, and how they can affect the brain and manifest in different ways, whether it's motor skills, language, cognition, behavior, social interaction, cause is hard to say. And truly, we don't understand everything that causes autism specifically at this point in time. But we know genetics, which is what I'm going to focus on for today's purposes, is a big factor, up to 80%, we think, in terms of a major factor that can explain why autism occurs. We also know that there are probably other factors out there that we're still learning about, things like environmental, which for the purpose of this conversation, I'm not going to go into. I'm going to focus on the genetics here. And there's probably other things that we're still learning about. And that's why oftentimes we'll say the cause is truly multifactorial. There's so many different aspects to consider, factors at play. And when it comes to the genetic component, again, it's one piece of the puzzle and it's so complex, and that's what we're going to talk about next. So when I think of genetics and autism, the word complex is always the word that I'm going to use, because we haven't yet identified every single genetic change that's been associated with autism or ASD or neurodevelopmental disorders. Again, there's so much that we've discovered even in the past decade, that there's so much more room that we need to learn more. And again, like I said at the beginning, not everyone with autism has the autism gene or the same genetic change, the same variant. There's so many different types of them. So just a couple examples that I've listed here. Some individuals might have a change involving a chromosome, like a missing piece on chromosome 16 here, and maybe that's the cause for their medical history. Others might have a change in just one specific gene, like if you've heard of Fragile X syndrome, which we'll talk about in a little bit too. And again, these are the rare, powerful genetic changes that have a big effect, the things that our tests are pretty good at detecting or finding at this point in time. But again, we haven't found everything. In reality, there are probably individuals, and vast majority of individuals, we would say, might have the collective effect, where they have many different smaller genetic changes that have a weak effect on their own, but as a collection might have this big effect in terms of causing someone to develop the symptoms of autism there. So sometimes it's a needle in a haystack. We find that one genetic change that's the answer to the question why. But most times it's probably a collection of different genetic changes. And even then, there can be things that we'll talk about in a little bit as well, like variable expressivity and reduced penetrance, where that same genetic change can manifest differently in different individuals too. So not everyone is a carbon copy of one another. And again, I said before, I'll be a broken record. Our knowledge of genetics is not complete. There's so much more that we need to learn, because every day, every month, every year, we're discovering new genes and new variants that might be associated with autism. And many times when we do our genetic tests, we still can't find that cause because there's so much complexity to it and so much that we don't know. And one piece that we think of in my world of genetics is sometimes when we have a child or an individual who has ASD and also has other major medical concerns. So maybe they were born with a heart defect or have a chronic kidney disease or have, multiple different organ systems that have different chronic medical concerns. Sometimes we have the highest chance of finding a needle in a haystack in those individuals, because if we think of that same gene or that genetic cause or that chromosome, it's expressed in every single cell of the body, and that's where we might see other manifestations too. So sometimes when we do genetic testing, we have a higher chance of finding someone in someone who might be finding something in someone who might be more complex. And again, genetics is one piece of the puzzle. Really, that multifactorial piece is probably the most likely explanation for a lot of individuals, but it's hard we can't go back in time and see what was happening during the pregnancy or at birth. We have tests and we have ways to look at the genetic information we were born with. And that's why I think genetics is the most promising avenue to explore and hopefully increase our knowledge over time too. Another really important point I want to make right now is when I say the word genetic doesn't always have to mean coming from mom, coming from dad. So as I said before, we get half our genes from mom, half our genes from dad. but we are all also born with our own unique genetic changes that are not coming from our parents, that don't skip generations, but are just unique to us, that we're born with. And we call them de novo, or new genetic changes in that person. And so this is one potential explanation for when I meet with families. A lot of times I hear there's no one else in the family who has autism or anything similar to my child or this individual. So where did it come from, and how can it be genetic if there's no family history? And we really think these de novo genetic changes are one explanation, where it's something unique to that individual. The other explanation could, again, maybe it's a collection of these smaller genetic changes that, just came together to create that perfect storm. And that's where no one else in the family has those symptoms, but it's that collection, that aggregation of smaller genetic changes that can have that big effect too. And so now that we've talked about genetics and autism, I've kept hinting at genetic testing. And so I really want to go over just the historical perspective of where we were, where we are, and where we're going with genetic testing, and how much of a journey it is, but also how much of this is really a personal journey. I'm going to keep using the word personalized, unique to every individual in their personal situation, what's going on in their lives at this point in time too. And truly, genetic testing is a collaborative purpose. So I like this picture, even though it's straight from Google Images, that there's so many different people that come into play just looking at one piece of someone's genetic information. And so to kind of show you where we've come from, I like this image that is going to show up next, showing how, back in the 70s, we knew of a genetic component to autism based on twin studies, saying that there were identical twins who share all, if not most, of their genetic information because they're identical, and seeing that there was a high concordance or high similarity in autism diagnoses between identical twins, fraternal twins, and then siblings. But again, it's not 100%. And that's where we think those other factors are at play to cause individuals to develop autism. And as we've, as time has passed, we've slowly found more genetic causes that are related to autism, but we really only had one genetic test available. So very slow progress here. After the human genome was sequenced, and again, we'll talk more about the genome as well, and more genetic tests became available either on a clinical or a research basis, you can see just the number of genes, the number of genetic causes or associations that we've been able to identify really exploded after the genome was sequenced and then newer genetic tests were available. So truly, it's interesting to see this relationship between our knowledge and how we're making the autism diagnosis based on those specific criteria, and just how much genetic testing and increases in genetics knowledge have really exploded our understanding. And again, this graph shows about 700 genes that might be associated with autism. And I think that number is just going to keep growing and keep continuing as we learn more. And so I really frame genetic testing as a tool to answer the question why, to say, is there an underlying genetic cause behind that individual's diagnosis? One key thing to keep in mind is genetic testing does not diagnose ASD or rule it out. Genetic tests are good at testing for what we know. They're not good at testing for what we don't know, because we have no way of evaluating them. So truly, when someone is thinking about undergoing genetic testing, or if it's being offered, it's because there's a certain medical concern that we're trying to figure out why. And definitely every individual is different. As everyone knows here, every child with ASD is unique. Everyone has their own challenges, strengths, weaknesses. And so, medical history and clinical presentation can guide our genetic testing strategy, but I'm going to talk about several different tests that we think about. And because there are so many different types of genetic changes, that's why the key piece here at this point in time in 2021 is there is no one perfect genetic test that can look at everything at once. So we're going to talk about different tests. And like I said before, testing is limited to what we know at this juncture in time and how good our technology is at that juncture in time too. And if anything, things are going to continue to improve over time too. Genetic testing for an individual who has a diagnosis of ASD has been recommended by multiple medical and healthcare organizations like the American Academy of Pediatrics, and 2 genetic tests that we're going to review in a little bit called Chromosome Microarray and Fragile X syndrome testing are truly the standard of care across the board, but there are many different types of tests. And so this takes me to theme number 3. I said this earlier. Thinking about genetic testing, making a decision about whether to undergo it or not is truly a personalized decision. I'm going to go over what are some of the benefits, the risks, the limitations, logistics, things to consider. And each of us on this call or watching this after are going to feel differently about some of the things that I bring up. And truly, it's about making the best decision for your family at that specific point in time too. And so some benefits or reasons to pursue genetic testing. I've told you how complex it is, so naturally, I'm sure everyone's wondering, well, why should we even think about doing it? Number 1 is trying to give you an answer to the question why. So many different parents that I talk to have said, yeah, the why question comes up. What caused this to happen? Where is this coming from? And potentially, if we find a genetic cause, we can say, this is it again. This is the needle in the haystack. This is the reason. And for so many families too, they'll use this phrase, knowledge is power. I will take as much information as I can at this point in time, because even if it doesn't benefit me right at this moment, potentially it will in the future. The second major benefit or reason to think about genetic testing is potentially it can give us information about, are there any other associated medical concerns that we need to look out for if we find a genetic cause? Is there something that we can be proactive instead of reactive about if we know what the reason is or what the cause is? And potentially can give us evidence to support the need for certain therapies or educational supports because we know there's an underlying cause, an underlying reason. And we'll talk about this in a little bit, that potentially in the future, as there are advances in medical management and treatment, potentially if you know the genetic cause first, you're first in line or have a you're ahead of the game in terms of figuring out what may or may not work too. The third major reason to consider genetic testing or the benefit of getting a positive result or finding a genetic diagnosis is it can help us with family planning. So one conversation I have with many families, with many couples, relatives is, what is the chance I could have a child who has an autism diagnosis due to a genetic cause if we find something in the family? And this is, again, remember, not all genetic changes are inherited or run in a family, and typically they don't skip generations too, but we'll talk about that in a bit. So if we find a genetic cause in a child and it's something that's de novo, new in them, not coming from mom, not coming from dad, then it might be reassuring to hear there's a low chance to have another child with that same genetic cause. And that can open up options for reproductive planning or reproductive options, even if there is something inherited or not too. And this is a point that I'm going to say now, and I will say multiple times again. Even if we find a genetic cause, even if we find a genetic change that we think explains that child's diagnosis, there is nothing anybody did to have caused this to happen, prevented this from happening. You literally cannot control what genes and chromosomes we pass down to our children or what genetic changes spontaneously happen in them. It is no one's fault. And I know everyone knows that in their hearts or in their minds, but sometimes it's helpful to hear one more person say it aloud. Even if we find a genetic cause, it's no one's fault. This is not the blame game here. And then the last group of benefits I would say are more psychosocial. So thinking about how it gives us a sense of closure, a sense of relief to finally know the reason, to put a name to it, to be able to say, this is it. And sometimes it helps to network or connect with other families who have children with the same exact genetic cause, being able to say ASD is a spectrum, but now that we know the cause, maybe we can narrow in specifically to, how these things manifest specifically based on that genetic cause too. And like I said before, this is not the blame game test, the point the finger test to say, hey, this came from mom's side or this came from dad's side. You cannot control what genes you pass down to your children, or again, what changes spontaneously happen to them. It's no one's fault. And then one really nice thing that I think can be somewhat unique to the autism community is Many families I talk to will say, well, even if it doesn't help me right now, maybe it'll help someone else and help our greater community. And I think that's just amazing that, all of you have such special places in your heart for the greater community and helping our understanding too. So we talked about some of the major reasons to pursue genetic testing. Let's talk about the reasons or limitations or risks of it. And the one major one is we have to be completely honest and realistic that at this point in time, even if we find a specific genetic cause, we find that needle in the haystack, the answer to the question why, the chance that we're going to be able to say, take this magical pill or take this medication, or here's a specific cure or treatment is highly unlikely at this point in time. We are getting better at finding genetic causes. We're not quite there yet in terms of fixing them, but that is our hope in the future, to be able to think about things that way, if that's something someone wants to think about. Again, there's nothing to fix, there's nothing to change as well too, but when it comes to genetic changes, some families might be interested in targeted treatments that might help with the symptoms too. I also say, even if we find a genetic cause, the chance for a day-to-day change in that child's life or that individual's life is also unlikely. Again, this might be information to help us in the future, or help us as we get older too, or as more is learned in the genetics community. Again, if we find a genetic change that might be inherited, there can be implications for other family members, whether it's thinking about their own family planning, or like I said earlier, sometimes it's easier said than believed, thinking about that blame game, or is it my fault? Did I inadvertently pass down something to my child? There can be concerns about genetic discrimination and information privacy, which I'll talk about next. And then one of the major limitations or risks of genetic testing is the results are not always clear cut. I wish I could tell you we get a positive result, we find a cause, and we're able to give you a roadmap for the future and say, this is what life is going to be like when you're 10 years old, 20 years old, 30 years old, 50 years old for that individual who's been diagnosed. But that is usually not the case too. As well as, because our knowledge, we're still learning, even if we get a negative or normal result, it does not rule out all possible genetic causes, because we haven't identified all of them quite yet. And we'll talk more about some of these other interpretations of genetic changes here too. And again, there's no one perfect genetic test. So even if we do every single test in the world and that child gets a negative result, or individual gets a negative or normal result, we can still never 100% rule out a genetic component there, because it's so complex. And again, we still think that multifactorial piece is truly the cause, but it's difficult to be able to confirm that 100%. And so one brief blurb that I'm sure we'll talk about in a little bit too at the end is genetic discrimination. So there is a law in the US called the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. We call it GINA. And this law says that health insurance and employers with more than 15 employees cannot use someone's genetic testing information or results against them in any way. So usually all genetic testing, if it's ordered by a healthcare provider or through a research setting, is protected under health information privacy laws. There's no database from our types of tests that people can access or look into, and everything's de-identified. And that's where, again, health insurance and employers who have more than 15 employees cannot use that information against anyone in any way. There are some exclusions at this point in time, or limitations, and I have them listed here. Life, long-term care, disability, and for members of the military who receive insurance benefits based on military status, potentially it's not that they're going to automatically discriminate, right? It's rare to see genetic discrimination, but there is the ability to ask or request that information to make decisions about eligibility and coverage. And so thinking about logistics, way back when, pre-COVID times, even before then too, blood was really the most reliable way of doing genetic testing, because it's such a stable, reliable way to look at the DNA or look at the chromosomes. But another advantage of time passing by is we've come up with much easier ways to go through genetic testing. And especially during COVID times, we've been really relying on cheek swabs or saliva tests to help be able to get samples that are good enough to do these analyses. And when it comes to genetic testing, if I use the analogy looking for a needle in a haystack, the best person to find that needle or to find that genetic cause is to start with the individual who has the diagnosis. So again, because we all have our own unique genetic changes, that's why if we want to find a cause, we start with the person who has the diagnosis, and then we can extend out targeted tests to parents or other family members, siblings, if we find that needle in a haystack and that person who has the diagnosis. And I see many families who have multiple children who have the diagnosis. And typically we might start with one sibling who has more severe medical concerns or might be the oldest in the family, and then again, offer targeted testing if we find something there too. There are other genetic tests where we might ask upfront for parents and siblings, everyone in the family to participate, immediate family, not so much extended family, to participate for comparison purposes, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. Cost has really come down a lot. So as more genetic tests have become available, the technology's gotten better. Definitely insurance companies have benefits for genetic testing, especially since some of these tests are medically recommended, medically necessary, standard of care. And many of these genetic testing laboratories have patient-friendly billing policies, whether we have to go down the insurance route or not. I will say for some of the newer genetic tests that we're going to talk about in a little bit, there are pretty strict criteria that can present a barrier for certain genetic tests too. And again, if it's a research participation, typically no monetary cost, we'll say, to participate there. Every single genetic test that I'm going to talk about next has different technology and different ways of interpretation or analysis. So that's why most genetic tests take some time to come back, because it's one thing to run it through the machine and get the data or get the DNA to look at or the chromosomes to look at. It's a whole nother process that can take much, much longer to actually interpret what we're seeing there too. And so that's where, not always do we have set timelines for certain genetic tests, or things can take longer than one would expect to. So again, here's another pop culture reference for those of us out there who might appreciate them. Theme number 4 is there's no such thing as one perfect genetic test. Just like in Lord of the Rings, there is one ring to rule them all. That is not the case when it comes to genetic testing. And so I'm going to start off with the 2 tests that typically, if you have an ASD diagnosis, should be done, again, as standard of care, recommended by multiple medical organizations, and many, many insurance companies have benefits that approve for these 2 tests specifically. The first one being the Chromosome Microarray. So this test is going to scan through everyone's chromosomes, or scan through that individual's chromosomes, and it's looking at all of them at a super detailed level. And it's trying to say, are there any extra or missing pieces of genetic information or chromosome material? What we call a deletion if it's missing, or a duplication if it's extra. We also use the overarching term copy number variant to describe a change in the amount of genetic information. So the way I think about this test is we want to make sure, as a first step, does the individual have the right amount of genetic information, or do they have too much of something or not enough of something? And could that be the cause for that individual's ASD diagnosis? The technology for the Chromosome Microarray test, you'll see the word SNP, and that's how you know that's the current technology. And this changed over around 2008, 2009. So if you've had a Chromosome Microarray test that might have been before this time period, or you don't see the word SNP or SNP there, again, that's the technology. It might be time to think about getting this test done, because it's a newer technology that's been updated. And if you had a test done way back then called a karyotype, where it just created a picture of those chromosomes, like I showed in the beginning, we really don't use that test because it's just a picture. This Chromosome Microarray test is so detailed and fine-tuned to pick up even the teeniest, tiniest extra missing pieces of genetic information. The other genetic test that we typically recommend starting off with, if it's not already done, is looking for a specific condition called Fragile X syndrome. In the genetics community, we consider Fragile X syndrome to be the most common inherited cause of autism. In reality, in my community, it's the most common inherited cause, but in the grand scheme of things, we only find a positive result when we do this test, maybe 1 to 5% of the time. So very rare as well. But because we've known about this condition for so long, and it can also be so variable, that's why we always test for it. And this is what we call a molecular or DNA test. This would not be picked up on the chromosome microarray or any other test. This is one specific technology because Fragile X syndrome is caused by having too many of these specific blocks, or what we call CGG trinucleotide repeats in that gene. Because if you have too many, then the Fragile X gene, which is called FMR1, doesn't work properly. And that's what causes Fragile X syndrome, which is the cause for that individual's autism diagnosis. So this is one other genetic change and one specific test for that. Now, the next few tests that I'm going to talk about, I'm going to use the umbrella term of molecular DNA tests. And these are typically looking at the DNA sequence itself. These are tests that can be a little bit harder to get insurance to approve at this specific point in time in 2021. It really depends. But these are also the tests that have the most promise when it comes to finding new genetic associations or new genetic variants associated with autism. And we could do a test where we look at one specific gene, one specific instruction manual, and we look for a misspelling in the genetic code or the DNA. We could do a panel test where maybe we look at a set number of genes, maybe 100 genes or 500 genes or 10 genes that have been associated with a specific feature or specific condition. And then we also have, and this has been the most exciting part about working in genetics so far, exome sequencing, where we can look at all of the protein coding segments. So what we call the exons. So if a gene is like a book, I think of the exons like the most important chapters of that book, because they're the ones that actually create that protein or that tool that gets created to carry out the job of the gene. And we can just do a spell check, reading through those exons, looking for any genetic changes, but in all 20,000 genes, which is very exciting and an avenue for a lot of gene discovery here. The interesting thing is the exons, so again, those most important chapters or sections of our genes only make up about 1% of our total genetic information. The genome, which is all 3 billion DNA letters, all of our genetic information, for so long, we used to call it junk DNA because we just didn't know what it meant. But now we're learning, hey, there are individuals who have genetic changes in these other sections that might not be in the exons, and maybe that's the cause for their autism. So this is what we call genome sequencing when you're looking at everything. Exome sequencing is looking specifically at the protein coding regions. Again, the most important sections that we know of today, trying to find a sequence genetic change, a change in the DNA itself. So shifting gears a little bit from types of genetic tests and now talking about what are the possible results. So I have this picture here of Pandora's box because everyone comes from a different place when they think of what they're hoping for from genetic testing. Am I hoping to find something, or am I hoping we don't find anything? Or could I find something that I'm not expecting to? So there are 4 different possibilities in general, and these apply to the chromosome microarray tests, panel tests, exome sequencing, genome sequencing in particular. And this is what I call, number 1, a positive result, meaning we found a needle in a haystack. We found a genetic cause, a single genetic change or some type of change in the genetic information, and we are saying this is it, this is the cause. My hope is if we get a positive result that I have lots of information to tell you about what is the condition, what do we know about it, are there any other medical concerns we need to think about, are there any other medical management things we need to be considering. But I always give families the caveat or the warning up front that many of these positive results, these diagnoses, these genetic diagnoses are very rare. So your child may be 1 out of 50 or 60 individuals in the world who has that exact same genetic condition. And so you may ask me lots of information, like questions like, what is the future going to look like? Or where do we go from here? And we'll have to say, we don't know yet. but we're going to keep investigating too. And that's where follow-up with genetics is important, because as we learn more in genetics, we want to keep you updated. And as your child or that individual gets older, we want to keep updated on how they're doing as well. But the other nice thing about getting a positive result too is we can connect families together with other individuals who have children or individuals with the same genetic cause. So Simon's Searchlight is a really nice group that's trying, looking at specific genetic causes for autism, but trying to connect families so that you have more of that family-centered or individual genetic condition-centered approach too. And that's been very nice, I know, for a lot of families to just remind themselves you're not alone, you're not the only person. It can feel quite isolating, even when you get a diagnosis of a rare genetic condition, and connecting with other individuals is so important, as well as research opportunities. So even if it's a super rare condition right now that we don't know a lot of, if you want to learn more, help us learn more, research opportunities, especially when we find that genetic diagnosis, can be super helpful as well. And then the other major piece to talk about with getting a positive result, finding a genetic diagnosis, is thinking about inheritance and what we call recurrence risk or family planning counseling. So for many of these genetic changes, there are different inheritance patterns. And I'm going to go through the three main ones that we think of next, meaning, is there a chance it could run in the family, or there's a chance to have another child with that same genetic change. But again, as I've said earlier, remember, not all genetic changes are inherited. So if we find a needle in a haystack in a child, definitely, in order to figure out if it's something running in the family or not, we have to test mom and dad, whether it's at the same time or after we get that positive result. Complicating factors is there are some families where we'll find a genetic change in the child and we test mom and dad who don't have ASD, but we find out one of them has that same genetic change, and maybe it's just manifesting differently in them. So again, variable expressivity means same genetic change in the family, just different symptoms of the condition. Or reduced penetrance could mean no symptoms at all, even though they had that same causative genetic change. And this is where, again, genetics is super complex, and every single genetic change that we've identified has these nuances that come along with it too. One tough thing to say is if we do not get a positive result and a family asks me, what is the chance that I could have another child with autism, even if we've done every single genetic test in the world and they've come back without answers, or we do none, we estimate right now, based on the empiric or literature, it would be an increased risk, 10 to 20%, to have a second child with an ASD diagnosis. And if there's already 2 or more children who have the diagnosis, the next child, it could be as high as 33 to 50%. And again, that's a range. So it's hard to give some specific numbers to that because we don't know the genetic cause. But if we do know a genetic cause, we get a positive result. That's when, depending on the inheritance pattern, we can give a specific number. So if there's a genetic change that follows an autosomal dominant inheritance pattern, that means only one copy of the genetic information, one copy of the gene or one copy of the chromosome needs to have the genetic change in order to have the condition. And that would also mean there's a 50% chance to pass it down to a child. 50-50, flip of a coin, doesn't matter if it's a boy or girl, 50-50 chance if it's an autosomal dominant condition. If it's an autosomal recessive condition, that means both copies of the gene or both copies of the chromosome need to have that particular genetic change. And when both of those copies of the gene aren't working, that's when we have the symptoms of the condition in recessive conditions. If you only have one genetic change, we would consider you to be a carrier who typically does not have any symptoms at all, because you have one working copy and one non-working copy. So if we have 2 parents who are carriers of the same genetic condition, there's a 25% chance to have a child who has that condition, just based on inheriting both of the copies of the gene that have the genetic change. And this is where sometimes, if it's a recessive condition, it can seem like it's skipping generations, because some people are carriers, some people are not, and then some people do have the condition. The next type of inheritance pattern is what we call X-linked. This means the gene is located on the X chromosome, or it's something involving the X chromosome. And remember, girls have 2 copies of genes on the X chromosome because they have 2 X chromosomes, whereas males only have one X and one Y. So if we have a condition that's X-linked and mom is a carrier, she has 1 genetic change on 1 copy of her X chromosome, that's where there is a 50% chance to have a son who has the condition because they get 1 X from mom, 1 X from, or their Y from dad, excuse me. And then there's a 50% chance to have a daughter who's a carrier because she gets 1 X from mom, 1 X from dad. So this is where gender can sometimes have differences in the manifestation of the condition because boys only have 1 copy of that gene on the X chromosome. If dad is the individual who has the condition or is a carrier of the condition, he will never pass it on to his sons because he only passes the Y chromosome onto his sons. But all of his daughters or any daughter that he has will be a carrier because she gets 1 X from dad, 1 X from mom. So I kind of sped through those inheritance patterns, but we can always go back and talk about them. And when it comes to family building options, there are so many different reproductive options out there. So if we find a genetic cause and a family says, I'm really concerned about this, I don't want to have another child who has this genetic condition, depending on the genetic change, there might be options going through IVF or pre-implantation genetic testing before an established pregnancy. There might be opportunities to do testing during a pregnancy or prenatal diagnosis. And then, of course, there can be testing done after that pregnancy is, or after that baby is born too. And again, we always talk about family building. There's so many different options and no one size fits all. So there are also different things like donor, egg or sperm, or adoption, or again, natural conception, natural delivery too. And this is truly a personalized discussion too. And everyone feels differently about testing before, during, after pregnancy, if needed or if possible. And that's where we have our colleagues in the prenatal or preconception genetics world who we would refer individuals to. So we talked about possibility number 1, a positive result. We found a genetic cause. Possibility number 2 is a negative result, meaning we look through the genetic information for that particular test and nothing came back. Remember, a negative normal genetic test does not rule out all possible genetic causes because that test can only look for one type of genetic change, or again, we still haven't figured out every single genetic cause or genetic change associated with ASD at this time. So sometimes we might think about additional genetic testing if indicated, or we might say, this is what we can offer in 2021, revisit us next year, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and let's see what might be new or what else we can offer too. So for most genetic tests, you might get a positive or a negative result. You find a clear cause or you don't find anything. But there are some genetic tests where we can get really confusing and complex information as well. So I call this a variant of uncertain significance, or possibility number 3, an unclear, inconclusive result. This is where we tell a family we found something, but we have no idea what it means. And it could be maybe we've never seen it before in the medical literature or in our databases, or maybe it's something that we just don't have enough information about. So we can't say it's the cause, we can't say it's completely normal, we're stuck in the middle there. And this is where, most times uncertainty ends up being just a normal change that hadn't been discovered or reported before, but sometimes it could end up being the answer and we're stuck in the gray zone. And I have a real conversation with families to say, how would you feel if we were to do this genetic test and we told you we found something, but we have no idea what it means? Is that going to cause some fear, some anxiety, some stress? Are you going to stay up all night Googling things and losing sleep over something that, again, is inconclusive? It's not a diagnosis. Or are you going to say it is what it is? We've lived in uncertainty for so long. I haven't hit my quota of it quite yet. And I'm okay with unclear information because at least it's something that we can continue to learn about. And that's our hope. That as more people do genetic testing, as our knowledge gets better, what's unclear in 2021, maybe if we look again in the future, we'll be able to have some more definitive information too. The last possible result I want to talk about from genetic testing is what I call an incidental or unexpected finding. And again, this is possible with some genetic tests, not all of them. It really depends. And this is where we find a genetic change that's completely unrelated to our purpose of doing the test. So something related to ASD, we find something else. So I have a few examples here. So one is some of these tests can tell us if mom and dad are related by blood. So what we refer to as consanguinity, some type of relationship, blood relationship between parents. And for a lot of couples that I talk to, that would be very unexpected information to hear. Or sometimes we can get in tricky situations where we might find out mom isn't mom, dad isn't dad, just based on the nature of the test too. Sometimes we can find out someone is a carrier for a condition that's completely different and unrelated to ASD. And then sometimes we can find out risks for other medical conditions. So for example, on exome sequencing and genome sequencing tests, sometimes you can decide, do you want to learn about secondary findings, like certain genetic changes that might increase your risk for hereditary cancers or hereditary heart conditions. And that's where sometimes you can opt out of that information, and sometimes you're kind of stuck with potentially learning of unexpected information too. And some people say knowledge is power. If there's anything else in that genetic information I want to know about it, I'm okay with that possibility. Others might say, I have my hands full. I have enough on my plate right now just dealing with the ASD diagnosis. I don't want to add new worries or new concerns about other risks that may never happen as well. And so switching gears a little bit too, I want to make a point that not all genetic evaluations are the same. So I'm going to focus in on clinical genetic testing or clinical genetic evaluations, and then research genetic evaluations. So clinical is where you might meet someone like me, a genetic counselor, or you have a doctor who says, I'm going to order this genetic test for you, and it would be performed at a genetic testing laboratory. And I named a couple here. And typically in that clinical setting, when we see a child who has an ASD diagnosis or an individual with ASD, again, we'll start with the Chromosome Microarray Fragile X because they're standard of care, and it's much easier to get insurance to approve those types of tests at this point in time. And then depending on the child or individual's medical history, we'll talk about, should we do exome sequencing or a panel test or more genetic testing after that? Because truly the purpose of clinical genetic evaluation is to say, can we identify an underlying cause for that individual's medical history? And the purpose is to be used for medical decision-making. If we find something, is it going to help the child or help us in some way? Is it a genetic diagnosis that can be used for medical management? But again, as I mentioned earlier, with the clinical genetic testing, definitely insurance coverage and cost can be a barrier and sometimes difficult to navigate. And that's where we also have research genetic evaluations or genetic opportunities. And SPARK, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, is one of the most amazing opportunities I think we have available today for the ASD population, where they have so many different genetic tests that are available: exome sequencing, genome sequencing, microarray, depending on what they're doing in their specific analyses, but many opportunities there. And I like to think about how genetics is just one piece of SPARK, right? That we're trying to learn more, discover more genetic associations for ASD to help us understand ASD, but there's so many more opportunities to advance autism research and knowledge and learning through SPARK that you're, best of both worlds in that sense, if you choose to participate. One thing to consider with research genetic testing like SPARK for autism is there's no guarantee of results within a specific guaranteed timeline, right? Because there's so many different processes that go into place and so much interpretation and analyses that, you're not guaranteed you send a sample this day, by 2 months later, you're going to get a result. That's not necessarily something that's set in stone. But because it's a research opportunity, there's that ongoing analysis where I think I've heard them say about 10% of participants so far have received a result, and that's going to get higher and higher and higher as that ongoing analysis occurs too. So even if you don't get a result right now, not to say in the future that you won't as well, which is very nice. And then a really nice aspect of certain research opportunities, including SPARK, is even though it's a research study, it doesn't replace clinical testing, but if there is a reportable finding, they do confirm it on a clinical standpoint. So it can eventually be used for medical decision-making too. So best of both worlds again there. Just to throw out this last point about direct-to-consumer genetic testing. So if you've heard of 23andMe and Ancestry DNA, these are completely different types of genetic information or testing than what I talked about here. They are not doing exome sequencing. They are not doing a microarray. They're just looking at common polymorphisms or common genetic changes, and they're just talking about traits or predispositions for certain specific things, or again, ancestry. So it's very clear on all of these websites, 23andMe included, it's not diagnostic. It's not meant to replace clinical evaluation or research evaluation, truly clinical in any way. It's just looking at traits. And there are limitations in their analyses. Even if you download that raw data, we've had studies that have come up that have shown high false positive rates because the technology is so different and it's a different analysis, a different process and different interpretation, that maybe up to 40% of the time you might see something inaccurate depending on the type of data that you might be looking at. And again, there's different considerations about how that information is used and if you might find those unexpected findings that can be reported out or seen. So I wanted to make the point too that you don't have to pick one. Even though all of these different evaluations are not technically the same, definitely we think of in our community how the benefit is for participating in clinical testing if it's possible and participating in research testing. You can do both. And definitely if you're interested in ancestry and think of it as a fun project or specific traits, with careful thought process, thinking about direct-to-consumer testing too. And then just finishing up in the last few minutes as well, talking about genetic counseling. So I admit I am completely biased. I am a genetic counselor. I work with kids and adults who have neurodevelopmental disorders or certain genetic conditions. And really my role is to help families and help that individual make decisions about how genetics plays a role in their life or their family, and trying to empower you with that information so you can make that specific decision, the best decision for you and your family at that most important piece or timeline. And so if you come see a genetic counselor for the first time and the talk is about having genetic testing, all the things that I just went over today happen in that conversation, especially when it comes to informed consent for doing a genetic test. Because again, same content that we go over, but it means differently for different families at different points in time too. And just to quickly share, some of the other conversations I have don't have to be just about genetics. Lots of families come to me saying they feel overwhelmed and lost. There's so much to think about after receiving a diagnosis, and it's hard to prioritize not just genetic testing, but what does genetics play in all of this? Is it something that we can try to regain a sense of control and manage that uncertainty? Or is it something that's going to help us cope? Or maybe it's going to cause more stress or worry, especially if we hear there's a genetic reason. Maybe there's a negative association with that too. And so, again, personalized discussions that vary between everyone because it means differently for everyone too. And then, after results come back too, typically if I'm a person who had met the family to talk about testing, I'm the same person to give them the results. Or oftentimes we might see families who have had testing done elsewhere and coming to us for our interpretation in the context of their child too. Because remember, genetic testing is a tool. They don't get the pleasure of meeting you, meeting your family, understanding the clinical history. And that's where your clinicians are super helpful in terms of saying, what does this mean in the context of my history, my health, my family as well? And we're really trying to make plans in terms of follow-up, what else we need to do, connecting with other resources and support groups and networking, and then also, having those discussions about family members and family testing if applicable too. Okay, so that was a lot of me talking at everyone. So I wanted to summarize my takeaway points. Number one is we have lots more that we need to learn when it comes to the relationship between genetics and autism. We have learned so much and we have come so far, even in the last decade when it comes to genetics, but it's still evolving, still learning. And so there's so much we need to figure out too. When it comes to embarking on this conversation about genetics and genetic testing, truly it's a collaboration, not just between individuals from a healthcare standpoint or research standpoint, but getting the family involved, discussing what this could mean for everyone. And truly, there's so many people at play on this diagnostic odyssey if we embark on this quest too. Theme number 3, I've said it before, I'm a broken record. There is no right or wrong decision when it comes to deciding to pursue genetic testing on our clinical research, or direct-to-consumer way. Everyone has their own reasons, their own priorities, and there's no right or wrong decision. Genetic testing will never go away. If anything, it's going to keep getting better over time. So there's no time limit on any of this. And again, genetic testing is a really, really helpful tool, but it's limited to our current knowledge and technology too. So we have been able to make genetic diagnoses, we have been able to find things, but there's also a huge number of individuals where we haven't yet, and that's where we need to really expand. And when it comes to thinking about all of this information, I hope I've given you things to mull over, things to think over, things to discuss with those you trust, whether it's a healthcare provider or your family or your support system. I think it's so important to think about what this means for everyone. And hopefully you have someone in your life that you can talk about this with. And again, I'm totally biased, but genetic counseling can be especially helpful with trying to make it personalized or customized discussion for your specific situation too. And we have no buy-in with doing the genetic test or not. It's truly what makes sense or is the best decision for your family at that point in time. And then again, like I said, clinical and research genetic testing do not replace one another, and they're not mutually exclusive. You can do both. And truly, if I had a crystal ball, I think the future of all of this is in research opportunities, specifically SPARK. I think this is how we're really going to pave the way for the future understanding of ASD, not just on the genetics, but all together. And I think this is a huge avenue or opportunity to learn more about the genetics too, because we're so limited in terms of what information we have, what data we're able to look at. But the advantage of SPARK is, we have so many different families who choose to participate, and that's how we're going to learn more and discover new things. So just to spend a couple minutes, and I'm sure we'll talk more about SPARK in a little bit too. If you are in the US and you have a diagnosis of autism or have a child with an ASD diagnosis, and ideally if parents are able to participate as well, that would be great. The registration is pretty harmless, pretty quick, and it does include receiving a saliva kit, so no blood work for this type of testing as far as we know at this time. And again, not just the genetic discovery, but also learning more about ASD, connecting with research studies, helping our future understanding. This is where it's exciting, where we're going to learn more. And this is one really, really exciting opportunity to do that as well. And so I have the link for the website here, but again, we'll share it after as well in case you're interested in participation. And just to give you a quick snapshot, there's been many, many individuals who have started on this genetic testing piece of this and going through the exome sequencing or genome sequencing. Again, it depends, and just being able to learn more. And while these are big, impressive numbers, I think we can do better. And I think we need to do better in order to be able to have a big impact on our community as well. Okay, lots of me talking again. Thank you all so much for letting me participate in this discussion and share this information with you. I'm happy to share my email address in case anyone has questions, and we'll take questions right now as well. Thanks.
Elisa, thank you so much. That was really great. We did have a question come up in the chat, and I just wanted to present it to you. So you had discussed one of the possible outcomes for genetic testing is a result that you find something, but you don't know what it means. And the question, I think, sort of relates to that question, to that sort of situation. Is the question asked, is there a gene bank or a database that for ASD genetic testing, when researchers or scientists or clinicians sort of find something and they don't know what it means, that other researchers and scientists and clinicians can use to sort of gather more information, gather more data about those genes?
Yes, the short answer is yes. And I would say there are multiple databases actually, and there's so many different realms within them. So one popular one in the ASD community is what we call Safari, where we can see some of these known and some unknown genetic changes in that database within the context of ASD. And then in the clinical world, there are also options or databases that we use between the genetic testing labs, but also worldwide, that are trying to characterize either unknown genetic changes or known ones. And this is where that interpretation is key. The more information we have, the more data sharing, which is a big thing in genetics, with appropriate privacy information too. That's where this is really exciting, and lots of opportunities for collaboration there too.
Great, thank you. There were no other questions that came up throughout the presentation, but if anyone wants to type one into the chat, we could certainly try to answer that now. Or if anyone has questions about SPARK, the research study, the SPARK team from the Center for Autism and Related Disorders is here. Happy to answer questions about that process as well. If anyone wants to type anything into the chat, and if not, I'm sure all of us here will be happy to follow up by email with any questions. Of course, this isn't a time for specific questions about your own family or your own specific genetic concerns, but if there are any generic questions about genetic counseling, that would be great. Just let us know.
I see there is another question in the chat box. Kyla, can you see that one?
Oh yeah, here's another one. So the question asks, are there options available for people who are over 18 and if they don't want to participate in SPARK? Does Kennedy Krieger and CARD specifically offer genetic counseling for adults?
Yes, so I can say for myself, I'm the genetic counselor at CARD, the Center for Autism, but then there are also more of us in other Kennedy Krieger clinics, and we don't have an age limit that I'm aware of. I know every institute is a little bit different, and insurance also plays a big role into this. So at Kennedy Krieger, I can say we definitely talk about genetic testing for adults. We see many adults as well over the age of 18, but again, there's those other logistical considerations. And I didn't hit on this, but on that slide, there's a website that says findageneticcounselor.com, where, you know, I would love to meet everyone here and have that discussion, but that also means that you can go into that website, plug in your zip code, look for adult genetics, and see if there's a genetics provider closer to home or might accept your insurance, depending too, that can talk about that genetic evaluation on a clinical basis, or if there are other research opportunities too.
Great, thank you. And another question has come in about gender differences and how the question asks, can sons only get these types of genes from their mothers? I know you talked about, you had that chart on, I think that actually the participant said slide 37 and 38 about how things can be passed down from our X and Y chromosome.
Yes, so slides 37 and 38 are specific to when the genetic cause is due to a gene on the X chromosome. So for X-linked conditions, again, the gene has to be on the X chromosome. That's where the cause is. Boys get their X chromosome from their mom. So if mom has that genetic change too, there's a 50% chance the son will inherit it. Now, remember, we also talked about de novo changes, or changes that might be new in that child. So it's possible mom could be a carrier if it follows an X-linked inheritance pattern, but it could also be possible that maybe that genetic change is new in that son and was not inherited from mom. But then when son goes to have children, remember, he will pass it to his daughters, but will not pass it to his sons. This is where it gets a little bit tricky. And you have to know the specific gene to be able to give that specific number. I hope that answered that question.
The next question is about SPARK, and I can answer it. The question said that, I think it's about SPARK. They provided saliva samples several years ago, but my husband wants to participate. Do I need to register? So you just need to invite the second parent, and they can participate when it's time. So you and the son to this individual who's participating, you don't have to re-register anything. You just have to invite the second parent. And that's how it works for SPARK in general, if anyone else wanted to know. the first parent and the kiddo with autism would register and then invite the second parent to participate if they are available. Of course, SPARK recognizes that every family is made up in different ways, so there's not always two parents who can participate, and that's okay too. The next question is about Fragile X syndrome, and Elisa, if you wanted to answer it, I don't know what your expertise is on this, but it asks, can Fragile X occur as a de novo gene variant if parents are not carriers?
Anything is possible in genetics, so I have to say most often a parent is a carrier. If the child has Fragile X syndrome, just based on the type of genetic change it is, that it's these specific number of repeats in the gene, everyone has a normal number of repeats in that gene. There's normal, there's individuals who are in the in-between range, which we think of as a carrier, and then there's that possibility expands to become too big and unstable to have the condition. So I don't want to make a specific rule to say never, but highly unlikely. I would say that Fragile X would be de novo. Parent would most likely be a carrier. And again, if it's a boy, mom is the carrier because the gene is on the X chromosome. If it's a girl, then we talk about testing both parents because mom or dad could be the carrier.
There's another question. If maybe you could discuss sort of what the evaluation of when you go to CARD specifically in your case for genetic testing, are there other portions of the evaluation that the kiddo might and the family might receive? Like CARD does a lot of team evaluations. Is the genetic counseling a part of one of those teams, or is it sort of a separate portion of an evaluation?
Yeah, I can speak to CARD as well as other genetics providers. At CARD, typically what I'm doing is getting patients referred from, if the patient or individual already sees one of our other teams or physicians at CARD, they're referring to me for the genetic counseling discussion. However, I do work with one of our pediatric neurologists and neurogeneticists as a team as well, in case there are other neurological concerns. We have that joint evaluation too. So it truly depends on the medical history. I can say at CARD that if you're interested in meeting with me to talk about this, ask your provider, whether it's a physician or a speech language therapist or occupational therapist. Or again, you can email me directly as well, just to talk about, can we have that conversation too? And that's specific at CARD. Outside of CARD, outside of Kennedy Krieger, definitely many genetic counselors will see patients on their own for these types of discussions, or might have a physician working with them as well too.
And then there's one final question about other instances from chromosomes other than the X chromosome where the father passes genes on to sons.
So autosomal dominant conditions. Remember, that's where gender does not play a role because the genes are on the numbered chromosomes, not on the X or Y chromosome. So that is a situation where that genetic change could be on any chromosome or any other gene that's not on the X chromosome, and it's 50-50 chance to pass it down. Doesn't matter gender at all. Recessive conditions, again, that would require both parents being a carrier in order to have the condition there too. There are some other rare scenarios that I didn't get into in this particular discussion. We talk about the Y chromosome sometimes too, if there are genetic changes there, as well as there's a rare phenomenon in genetics called mosaicism, where a parent might have that genetic change in some, but not all of their cells, and they pass that down to a child. And that's where, again, doesn't matter gender, but it could still change as well.
Thank you. The gender and the parents passing down, I know, is a source of confusion for many people, myself included, who are unfamiliar with genetics so specifically like you are. So it's great to have an expert speak on that.
Definitely, it's confusing and it depends so much.
Yeah. Another question is, are there online resources for learning more about genetic components to ASD that anyone can access?
Yeah, there are a lot of good websites that talk about genetic evaluation for ASD. One good website, just in terms of general terms, is called Medline Genetics. And that has just, if you see a weird genetics term, you want to type it into their search bar. They have a really nice patient-friendly or general-friendly way of writing it out. And then there are certain websites, I think from certain institutions or hospitals that will have more online facing material about genetic components to ASD. And then again, I think the best way to have that personalized discussion is, again, meeting with a genetics professional or someone who's familiar with genetics and genetic testing too. I can say for where I work here at CARD at Kennedy Krieger, we have our own little one pager that we'll send to families that has, question answer format, benefits, risks, limitations, whether they're interested or not. And that's what we kind of provide to families on our end specifically too.
Okay, I'm going to say, I think that was the last question that I see, but if anyone else, Megan, or anyone sees a question that I've missed, let me know. But I think that was it. Those were really great questions, really great answers.
Great questions, great questions.
I don't see any more. Just a great thank you for a great presentation. I agree.
Oh, thank you. Thanks everyone for your attention. I really, really appreciate it. And again, sorry if it came off as a lecture. Definitely, I prefer having more conversation and interactiveness too, but it's hard in a setting like this. And hopefully sooner rather than later, you'll continue to have that conversation offline too.
Thank you so much, Elisa. It was really great. Thank you everyone for joining. I believe you will get a follow-up sort of just how did this presentation go for you email from Pathfinders. So look for that coming to you in your inboxes. And also this presentation was recorded, so it will go up via Pathfinders if anyone wants to refer to it later or pass it along to friends and family.
Yes, that's a good online resource too. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Elisa.